Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or 50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hi, my name is Mariam Naiem. I am from Ukraine, but I'm from Afghan origin. I was studying culture, so I basically want to call myself culture studier person. But right now I'm working as a UX designer. But I guess here the most important that I'm Ukrainian and my family's there, and my brother was at war for the last couple of months.
I'm Romeo Kokriatski. I'm a journalist here in Ukraine, and I am also the co-host of the Ukraine Without Hype podcast.
So I wanted to have both of you on when Mariam and Romeo is going to help me co-host, as we've been doing with the Ukraine-related episodes so far on the podcast, to sort of have a pretty open-ended conversation, as 80% of these episodes are, kind of reflections on what's been happening, what we think might happen next, that sort of thing, and also kind of talk around the topic or on the topic and around the topic of Russian colonialism and imperialism, a topic that outside of the regions affected, essentially, is very much downplayed at best, if not completely ignored and or in some cases defended, and all people say it doesn't exist, essentially, or has never existed. Uh, or due to our regions that we focus on and the ones we are familiar with, we'll mostly focus when it comes to that kind of discourse on the differences between, for example, in Europe versus the US. And even in Europe, there's like a Western Europe and Eastern Europe difference, obviously. And I will try my best to include also, I think, the common discourses that I've seen coming from the Arab world as well, which have been at times equally problematic, to be honest. But what are some reflections that you want to share of the past, I don't know, past few weeks or past couple of months or however far back you want to go, to be honest?
So I guess if it's okay if I will start. Yep. So um, for me, the biggest shift happened exactly 3 weeks ago, because it was first time since war started when I came to Kiev, and it kind of changed my whole perception of what is happening there, and whole perception actually of Ukrainian society also. So right now I'm still in this very strange phase where I cannot describe fully what do I feel, but for sure this is something that changed my mind, because before that I can relate only to 24th of February, that it was kind of the same amount of shock that I received. So it's interesting to be right now, and actually it's interesting that because I want to go back again as soon as possible, which is I didn't expect that.
Romeo, you've been, as far as I remember, you've been there since it started, since February. So, but I mean, recently things got worse, at least as far as like your personal connections are concerned. I don't know. You can speak to as much as you want about that. Obviously, feel free to share what you want to share.
Yeah,
But
I
what
mean,
what can you say? Yeah.
it's been it's been absolutely a challenge. Like, I don't think there's a rule book for how you're supposed to feel or act during a war. Um, And especially a couple of weeks back, there was the strike in Vinnytsia, which is my hometown, which is where I typically live. I'm in Kiev at the moment. But usually I spend my summers in Vinnytsia anyway, though since the beginning of the war, I've been living in Vinnytsia this whole time. And especially if you're not on the front lines, and it's easy to feel disconnected from what's happening. I think most of the country felt this way during the past 8 years of war, where Donbass just seemed far away. And if you didn't know people who were fighting, you didn't know volunteers there, you didn't know people living on the front, then it was easy to pretend that this is something um, far away that you could effectively ignore it. And of course, people in Donbass and the soldiers and the defenders fighting there this whole time complained about this. Though I don't know whether it's probably for the worse, but there is no kind of illusion like that now. After the Russians kind of left Kiev Oblast, and they stopped bombing like major highways like the Zhytomyr highway and stuff. Uh, and the stores started to open up again. People started to go out in the streets, and um, I won't say it was the same that this war is far away, but it, there was almost a sense that you could sort of relax. After the strike in Vinnytsia, like that's gone again. Air raid sirens that I kind of learned to ignore, I now pay attention to. I don't run into shelters yet again, but that was definitely something that I was like debating starting up again. And every time one goes off, it's no longer just this kind of background noise that you can filter out. There's a very clear sense that whoever is on the receiving end of that siren, um, or the missile's intended target, will likely not breathe again. And it really brings that into incredible sharp relief, that you know that every time that siren goes off, people die. And it could be anyone. It could be, we're not just talking about soldiers or people on the front. It could literally be anyone in the country doing anything at any time of day. Just completely unprovoked, random death falling out of the sky. And that is something, to be honest, I'm still struggling with processing and struggling to really comprehend on a base level, because we live in the 21st century. It's a relatively safe century, as world history goes. Um, so it's something that really does occupy quite a bit of my thoughts.
The first thing that sort of comes to mind, and I'm not gonna make this into a Lebanon thing because I do that sometimes and it's annoying, but just to, as a point of reflection, speaking from like my own experience, um, I've personally never been in a situation where I felt that a bomb can fall over me at any time. And that's because in the only war that happened in my lifetime, because I was born in 91, was the 2006 war, which was between Israel and Hezbollah. And it was sort of understood, and this is something that I mean, I was 15 back, I didn't quite understand anything, but I was told this by older folks and folks around me, whatever, that our area was safe because the Israelis were not targeting our area. And indeed, it was the case. Our area was safe. It lasted for a month, and we were okay. And it was only later on, literally 4 years later, when I started university in Beirut, that I started meeting folks from other parts of Lebanon whose experience of that summer was obviously extremely different. And that's my earliest memory of an understanding that war was here and war could have been above me, because I knew war was around me, and I could, even because of how the mountains work in Lebanon, and I come from the mountains, I could literally see the Israeli jets bombing Beirut. I could literally see them. Um, but I was 15. I was being protected by my parents, who were telling me, "Don't worry, you will be okay," that sort of thing. Um, I felt that, okay, well, personally, we're okay, essentially. And so there was a distance, an emotional distance between what was happening essentially to other parts of Lebanon and how my life was on a daily basis. as it happens, I mean, I don't usually want to spend too much time focusing on like online discourses and Twitter discourses and that sort of thing, and because it's just like 80% of the time is toxic. But there are certain things that I feel are common uh, misconceptions at best, if I want to be generous about this, and at worst, obviously, ill-meaning people who are just toxic and are being assholes online. But the misconceptions I want to focus on, because the assholes are not going to listen to this, and it doesn't matter what they think. But the misconceptions are that there is a certain idea of what war is like, and there's a certain idea of if anyone is doing anything that doesn't feel like it's come out of a Hollywood movie, therefore there's something they're lying, or there's something fake about their experience, or there's something that's just not, at the very least, there's something that basically, well, it's not worth paying attention to anymore. Like, this isn't really a war anymore, or this isn't whatever, because there's this one idea of what quote unquote a war looks like. And so I wonder if you can kind of use that as a start of a conversation on that. And maybe Romeo, since you've been there from the beginning, and Mariam, since you've returned recently, again, feel free to share as much as you want. The details are up to you, of course. Um, what can you how can you even describe the daily? How does that how do you wake up in the morning, and what goes through your mind as much as you can, basically? And I don't know who wants to go first. Go for it,
I
Mariam, if
can
you want. Yeah.
start first. So basically, from the beginning of war, of course, like my anxiety was on a very high level, and I needed way to compromise this anxiety and be able to do something. So I had a deal with myself that as far as my brother is safe, I'm I don't care. Like literally, I don't care. I just ignore. Of course, I'm thinking about war. Of course, I'm talking, but I'm trying to not be attached to that feeling. My brother's um, he was located to the war zone in April, and this is moment when I start to be anxious all the time. It was interesting because at some point I started to have dreams about my dead brother's body, and I didn't figure out why it's happening. And apparently I started to work also with a therapist, and she said that my brain is trying to adjust the idea with the idea that my brother could die, because it's something that I didn't expect. You know, typically we kind of prepare for the idea of our parents dying because it's normal, this is how it should be, but not siblings. It was interesting how my brain, how my conscious tried to do this homework just to prepare myself. So um, from April, it was a bit of nightmare, and I don't really remember anything happening, like emotionally. And when my brother was wounded, he was wounded in the beginning of June. It was two anti-tank mines that reacted, and my brother's car with the three people were just blow with the car. One person kind of died in the same second. Second person, he's in a coma right now, and my brother, he doesn't have his right eye anymore, and there was part of the brain apparently that also were injured. So after that, I was like, okay, now I'm done. The worst thing happened. Okay, it's not the worst thing, because this is another annoying part for me that a lot of people are saying. At least he's alive. I This is something that please people don't say. Like never say that. This is just horrible. So of course he's alive. It's understandable, but there is a lot of challenges also. So after that, I was able to focus on how actually people live there, how actually my friends are there. So I decided to come to Kiev just to see my brother, which was also emotionally very challenging because I trying to be honest with you, I was very scared. I didn't know how I will react to his body. I was very scared that he will see that I'm scared looking at him. Yeah, I guess it was one of the most embarrassing couple of seconds in my life when I saw that he's seeing that I'm scared to look at him. So I was focused only on that. You know, I was focused on my brother, and everything else that's happening, it was kind of on the background. But of course, something was happening. So I was living in the center of Kiev, and before that, I was sure that there is a huge gap of universe between people who ever heard siren and never listened to that. Like, I think there is a big difference, and because this is something that Western societies think that this is normal, but I think this is privilege to feel like you are living in a peaceful place and to feel safe. And when and we kind of born with this idea that this is how it should be. We should have food, we should have water, and we should feel safe. So when this very stable platform got removed from your under your feet, I guess this is like something that changed your life completely. So I was very curious how would they react to the first siren, and we were living very close to siren. Like, it was the source of the sound was very close to us. And it was very funny because my friends knew that I will be a little bit nervous, so they just come to my room with dog and just sit there and look at me with the dog, and it was very very funny. And they said that if I want to go to bathroom, we can go to bathroom, so we didn't go to shelter. Um, the noise is it's not pretty, it's not nice, but 2 days after that, as Romeo, I adjust to the sound. But what was interesting, and this is completely different when you live abroad and when you're in Ukraine. When you're living abroad and you hear about that, okay, there is sirens, there is something falling, like Russia is a terrorist state, this is obvious. But when you're there, I remember it was 4 a.m. 4, I just remember it was morning. I was very sleepy, and there was a siren, and my brain was like, I was thinking, oh my god, please not here, just not here. I want to sleep. And I woke up and I heard about Vinnytsia, and I was like, and I felt so much guilt that I asked not here. Yes, it wasn't here, and I realized this idea that you were saying, that each time you're hearing siren, someone can die or maybe dying. And this is something that I didn't understand while I wasn't in Ukraine. That there is aftermath after every sound, and this is something that just struck me. Also, that it's very annoying to. It was very annoying for me to live in society who, which I think cannot feel the same amount of empathy that I need. Like, people cannot understand me. So I felt very lonely in Europe, super lonely. But there is another thing. You feel very lonely, but your friends are living their lives. So in case you want to hang out or something, you can kind of switch off Ukrainian reality and you can relax a bit. But in Ukraine, you don't feel lonely. Your people are super united. This is such a nice thing to feel after a couple of months in Europe. But there's another thing. You you start to have any small talk with any person, and you start to feel like, the amount of tragedy for Ukrainian society, for me, it's like a wave, and you just know, okay, this is just a wave. But in Kiev, I was able to zoom and to see each drop of that tragedy. Like, you talk with the person on the street, and the amount of grief that this person is like right now feeling, you cannot even understand that. And of course, you're sharing your story and you see the same reaction from another person. And I've tried to talk with person who's working in the, I don't know, who's cutting your hair, and she's from Mariupol, and you were like, you don't know how does she work. After you talk, like, my friend, he right now he has a cat, and I'm like, oh, such a nice cat. He's like, yeah, my friend died in Bucha, this is his cat. Like, this amount of everyday tragedy, it's just enormous, and I didn't expect that to see. So this is like something that changed for me the whole experience. And also, on the railway station when I was coming back, it was super, like, typically, railway station is a pretty loud place, but it was super chill, and nobody even talked. But there was like maybe 100 people on the platform, and at some point I was like, why it's so quiet here? And I realized that people are just hugging each other, men and women, and they're not talking. And again, this is like another wave of silent tragedy. that you see, and you see that this amount of kids and mothers in the train, and like line of men looking at them, just looking, like not crying, just looking. So I guess for me this is something that shifted my perception a lot, that I felt very, I can feel very lonely in Europe, but in the same time I have this privilege to be distracted from war. In Ukraine, you feel very united. And also, to be honest, this is part of cultural propaganda, which is completely normal. Like we have big boards who are saying that world is with us. This is something that I didn't felt in Europe. Like that world is with us. I didn't feel that. Uh, but in the same time, you just live with this, yeah, with this tragedy every day, and this is something that crushing you down. And Romeo, I don't know how you actually. I think you need a lot of strength inside. Maybe you don't even realize that, but I just want to say that uh, I guess this is just undescribable. Um, the amount of information and emotion that you must feel every day.
My actually have a kind of amusing anecdote on that. I went to the endocrinologist recently, and she's like looking over my vitals. She asked me, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "Well, I'm a journalist." And immediately, without like pausing or a break in her like routine, she writes down, "Okay, here's a prescription for anti-anxiety medication." I think she kind of understood. Um, it absolutely is quite stressful, but at the same time, like you still have to live. Um, like time doesn't stop during war, as it turns out. Um, growing up, you'd read like the stories about World War II, and it just seemed like for those brief 5 6 years, just the world was just about the war and nothing happened except for the war. But in reality, it turns out things aren't like that. People get married, they have kids, they move, they get fired, they find new jobs, like they meet, like normal human existence keeps on rolling, and that feels really surreal at times. Like I had my birthday um like 5 days ago, and the whole time I was just thinking like, what am I celebrating? Like another year, like my country's at war, what am I celebrating? But at the same time, you go to a restaurant and you go out with friends, and obviously me being a journalist, we still just talk about the war. So life just keeps going. But actually, Miriam, I did want to ask. So since I've been like in Ukraine, I haven't left the country in quite a while now. What is the public mood like in Europe? Because like obviously I see like texts from like friends in like Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, and they're like, "Oh, we love Ukraine, we're supporting you," but like I don't really have a good sense of what Western Europe is like. What do Italians think? Like the Brits seem like they follow what's going on, but what do the French think? Like, what do Germans think? I'm really curious to know like like I guess the average Western European thinks about the conflict at all.
Okay, so sorry from for what you will hear, because my perception could be not very good. I mean, there is, of course, I cannot, I will generalize right now. This is, I cannot do anything else because I didn't do any studies. I would like to do some studies about that, but yeah, anyways, right now I couldn't. So there is a lot of interesting things. So, for example, first day of war, I talked with one of my coworkers. He's actually a pretty nice person. He's from Germany. He was asking me, this is first day, and because my brother, sorry, was already at war 5 years ago, so for me it was obvious that he will be drafted again. So my coworker asked me, when you will surrender, how many days? It was first day. I tried to explain, like I remember I didn't know what to answer, so I said that, like surrendering for us, it's not an option. So for us, death as a subject is the same as a just death. So as a society, so like it's not an option. And I realized, okay, they didn't get it. Next time I talk about something, I talk about Mariupol and how they were bombing theater with the sign "children" on the asphalt. My coworker said that, yeah, you know, but like um, they will never start another war, like a bigger war. I said that why not? They start war with Ukraine. My coworker said something like, yeah, but we have an agreement, and I said we also had an agreement, and she said, well, in this well, you have all this spectre of imperialism that you actually feel from Europe also. Like, yeah, but it's different, you know? Like agreement with Ukraine is not the same as agreement with, and you like it's very subtle. Like you cannot nobody's saying anything bad to you. Everyone is supporting. But, you know, like for example, you try to explain how your life changed, like you have whole house of refugees you didn't have in your place anymore, and they were like, yeah, but like you still like, no, you don't know what do I feel like, your life is the same. And at some point some of my friends told me that they have too much of war in Ukraine, and it was my friends, and I was like, yeah, it's too much for me as well. So I stopped talking to my friends about war because again I didn't know with who, like what should I do. And again, I cannot say that, you know, somebody is bad, someone is good, because I guess it's also very okay. I don't want to play therapist right now here, but anyways, this was also very hard for me. But at some point, it was interesting also that some of my friends told me that they were sure for whole life. They were This is what they were taught in school, that war is the most horrible thing in the world, and you need to stop it as fast as possible. They were saying that every time I'm looking at how Ukrainians are fighting, I'm thinking maybe it was wrong, but that maybe there is something more important than war, that to war to stop the war. So there was also a lot of stereotypes that is coming right now about Ukrainian refugees, which is interesting because most of Ukrainians look very European-like. So there is no like segregation by the appearance. But there was a moment, for example, when my friend there was she's living in a private house, so there was a salesperson who wanted to sell the alarm system. So the person was saying, it's like, oh, you need to have the alarm system right now for sure. My friend asked why. She said because there was Ukrainians. You know, you start to hear all of this thing, and this is very like, of course, with each week, you know that this topic is less and less relevant. At some point, my friends started to ask, not friends, but coworkers started to ask me, "Oh, it is better in Ukraine." Yes, I said, if you have it less on your news, it doesn't mean it's better. So, yeah, you okay, but this is for me. This is my perception.
I have the
From
same perception.
some communication with some people, I realized one thing: they're super scared, and they're much more scared than us because we were fighting, and our generation, our previous generation before that, they were fighting. This is another discussion of trauma of generations, but let's put it aside. That generation that didn't fight, and generation before, I'm talking about Western societies. So I remember how my friend, who is Italian, he asked me, "But you don't think that no?" He said, "Oh, something like you don't expect us to fight for you." And I said, "No, we just need your weapon." And he was so relieved. And I realized that you can actually almost physically touch this fear of having war, and you know for sure that behind all of these ethics words about how we should stop the war, about pacifism and so on, you know that behind of that there is a big fear to be in our shoes right now. So this is something for me very frustrating also, because I guess it's completely fine to admit that we are scared, we don't want to have war in our country, we are super scared, rather than say, oh, you're too emotional, you know, Ukraine's a different deal, Russia will never do that to us, all of that. Yeah, I don't know, did I explain you well or not?
Yeah, and I mean, I can only add to that by saying that I think from the beginning, I've been on this Signal group that I sometimes mention that Romeo is now a part of. Um, that from the beginning we sort of were worried, and the reason I'm mentioning that group is that it happens to have like Syrians and Bosnians and other groups of people that have some form of experience with at least what we're talking about, or some type of similarity or familiarity. But that the fear was the factor of time. That at the end of the day, there is a mixture of fear, as you said, Mariam. There's also a lot of cynicism in Western Europe, a lot of appeasement, a lot of just wishing it away, which at this point I think it's half of the EU's policy to just wish things away on most topics around the world, but especially and specifically on that as well. And to just not want to deal with something until you absolutely have to. And even when you absolutely have to, a lot of the time it's in reaction to what is happening rather than taking some kind of action. It's usually in response to something rather than acting in advance. As if there is the sense that you don't want to rock the boat too much. As if you're saying certain words or supplying certain weapons or doing certain actions or whatever it is, as if you're waking up the beast. As if you're waking up something that you don't want to wake up, essentially. And the irony, obviously, is that, and this is something that we have talked about on this podcast before, but obviously there was a lot of conversation in the beginning of, like basically towards the end of February, early March, when the first waves of Ukrainian refugees were coming to the rest of Europe. A lot of discourse about how non-white refugees were being discriminated against, white in quotation, etc., which is of course true, and that was and is still a problem in Europe in general. But what was often missed is that it's not that far off that at some point this will extend towards Ukrainians as well, because of the the stereotypes and the cliches and the racism and the xenophobia towards anyone from Eastern Europe. I mean, it's not that long ago. It feels like ancient history now, but it's not that long ago that everything Brexit-related discourse, half of the time was about Africans and brown people and Muslims and whatever, but the other half of the time was about Romanians and Poles and and that sort of discourse. It was really a lot about that. Now it's not in the front. It's not in the news as much anymore. You would see it if you go on the website and you search for it, you would find it. But I pay attention to what is front page news here in Geneva, for example, and I haven't seen a front page news on Ukraine in quite some time now, even after big revelations. I think Bucha was on it. I think that was one of the examples, but at some point it's like, well, we've covered 2 or 3 massacres, we're not going to cover a 5th one or whatever. There is that sense. It's very cynical. It's also there's a form of fatigue among some people, obviously, as well. But that fatigue can be turned also into cynicism. There's one, as Mariam said, there's one way. There's on the one hand saying, yeah, this seems really horrible and tiring, and I don't even know how to think about it. Like, I don't even know what to do, and I feel helpless and whatnot. That's one way of approaching it, and it's fair enough. If you don't know what to do, you don't know what to do. There's only so many times you can just tweet. At some point you feel like this isn't making much of a difference. But then there's the other side, which is, I think, the most cynical side, which I think ends up kind of creeping up to the surface when it comes to European politics, especially Western European politics. So yeah, that would be my addition to that.
That's something that I'm really scared of, is this cynicism turning into just outright apathy. Like in Italy, during the past 8 years of war, especially their media loved drawing equivalencies between Ukraine and Russia. Look, like, maybe the Russians are wrong to take part of Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are repressing Russians, and they're forcing everyone to speak Ukrainian, and other bullshit Russian propaganda narratives. And I'm really terrified if that again becomes the common feeling, is people pay less attention to the conflict as they get more and more tired of Ukrainians on social media complaining about the war, for them to, because it's easy, right, to just go, well, it's complicated. Russia's obviously done some horrible stuff, but I'm sure Ukraine's also done horrible stuff. So who can really say who the bad guy is?
It's always the but. It's always the I don't like Putin, but it's Russia is not good, but, and that's where everything follows after that.
Yeah, that fear, that equivalency really scares me, because I feel at that point Ukraine will seriously start losing international support, and we kind of rely on it. We need people to keep pressuring their governments to continue to support us financially and militarily. Without that, we will lose. And if the average kind of voters opinion is just going to be, well, it's this complicated, like, who can tell conflict, and the Russians have done bad stuff, and the Russians say the Ukrainians are doing horrible stuff, like, maybe it's not our business. We helped out in the beginning, now it's the Ukrainians' turn to solve this for themselves. When in reality, like, that's just an abdication of responsibility. It One of the things that kind of shocked me, Mariam, about when you were telling me, like, your European colleagues' reactions, is like, do they not like, the thought that kept going through my head is like, do they not realize how they are responsible for this? Like, is that not, like, you literally funded this regime, you legitimized it, you continue to push the narrative that Russia is a normal country, that once the trade links are established and everything, they'll come here for holiday, and they'll immigrate, and everything will be, like, completely fine. And there's no need to do they not, like, that was something that was shocking to me, to be honest. I guess we should wait for Joey to come back, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have here something to say because, oh my God, yeah. I was every time I'm talking about this topic, I am referring to one dude in ancient Greek time when Protagoras who's saying that human is a measure of everything, and I guess this is when we start this problem of human centrism and European centrism, of course. The idea that we are super we are individuals and we can live separate from the society. So I don't need you, you don't need me. My whole world, my whole personality is just such a huge universe that if I will die, the universe dies. So this idea of like the hyper individual centrism is very common and very typical in Western societies, which I think linked to second topic, the idea of my country doesn't have anything with your country because my country is living in a vacuum economically, culturally, so there is no connection. And if I live here good and you live there bad, it means this is your fault, not mine. And what I can say is I can pity you. I can give you some, I don't know, some help, but only if after that I feel like I'm a good person. If by helping you, you doesn't look like a refugee, you didn't look brown, you didn't look very poor. I don't want to help you because helping you is not helping me to feel better person. So when I'm trying to explain to them that there is for French person there is actually very distinguishable link to the idea that French government were selling weapons to Russia specifically when we had war, they are denying that or they're not. Like, I think this is the whole problem of again Western society, the idea that we live here good because we are good, because we are know how to live and you are weirdos. And when I try to say no, there is a reason why you live good, and it's connecting to the idea that other countries live bad. So we need to understand that this is whole responsibility is like responsibility for something that's happening in Africa right now. Like, this is Ukrainian responsibility as well. That's why I think it's important for us to talk about this as well. Or, for example, something that's happening in Afghanistan, it's also my responsibility. But again, this is burden that European people they're not willing to live with, because the idea, again, this is my perception, the idea of European values right now is about everyday comfort. Please give me my cup of tea, give me my very nice couch, and don't bother me. Like, just don't bother me. Yeah, and no, they don't have this idea of their responsibility at all.
While you two were talking, I went to get this. Well, people listening won't know what I'm talking about, but I'll describe it. Like, it's a pack of cards, and you can see people here, and it's basically with, of course, Vladimir at the front of it, our friend Putin. But it's a pack of cards that was prepared by a group called Public Eye, which is a Swiss NGO, anti-corruption, that sort of thing. And the pack of card is called Oligarque en Suisse, so oligarchs in Switzerland. And I swear to God, there's about, I think, I don't know, 40 of them or something like this, and something like half of them are Russians. And they're all here, either physically here or were here before, whatever. Now they're on some yacht somewhere, or their bank account is here. And in fact, their bank account is still here. Like, to this day, while we're recording this, recording this end of July for those listening. I don't have the statistics with me, but it was something along the lines of the Swiss government had announced a certain percentage of let's say how much money they had confiscated or at least seized or whatever, they were frozen, their bank accounts were frozen. But then the Association of Swiss Bankers, or again whatever the actual name is, came out and said that this is actually roughly 3% of the number of Russian oligarchy money here in Switzerland. So we are talking about like hundreds of billions. This is the number of, this is the amount that we're talking about. This is the difference between being able to fund, a himar or whatever. This is the kind of money that now I saw like a group of Poles were like fundraising online to get one. Like this is the amount of money we're talking about. But it touches very deeply. I will speak only on when it comes to Switzerland. It touches very deeply to something that's very taboo in Switzerland, which is that most people know that shit happens in Swiss banks. This is not rocket science. Everyone knows this. But it's like, don't talk about it too much. From time to time, maybe pass a law here and there. But don't think too much about the fact that all of these companies, whether we're talking about the oil barons or the what's the Azerbaijani dude, Aliyev, or whatever, all of those guys that have accounts here and there, you can type the name of the companies associated with them. You can see where the address is because it's just an office somewhere in like about 20 minutes from where I live. It's just that, and it's just considered as a business among other businesses, and most people don't want to think too much about that, because I think, and this is me being a therapist, which I shouldn't be, but I think there is a sense that part of the welfare state that we have, a percentage of that, a part of the reason why we have this amount of money that provides, although Switzerland doesn't really have a welfare state, but you see what I mean, that these comforts, these social services and whatnot, part of it comes from very dodgy sources, and we don't want to look into it too much. From time to time, it makes it, when there's something particularly egregious or something that's not very media friendly or what have you, sometimes it pops up in the discourse. But there's a difference between you finding out that Vladimir Putin has one bank account, in which case maybe many people will say, no, we need to shut this down, this is unacceptable. But there's a difference between that and then saying, well, actually, there's like 50 of them that have bank accounts. It's not just one person. There's like quite a lot of bank accounts around here, and probably they have multiple ones here as well. Same for the UK, for that matter. You mentioned Romeo, like, yeah, for the most part, definitely no, there aren't quite a lot of pro-Russian sentiments in that sense. But this is also the country that had like poisonings on UK territory like 5 years ago, the Skripal poisonings. And there's been a lot of that going on, basically. So I think like the Russians have burned some bridges when it comes to UK public sympathy. But that doesn't stop London from being a haven for Russian billionaires and Russian oligarchs, which it very much still is.
I mean, it didn't stop Lebedev from gaining a lordship.
Yes. Exactly that. So, it's
one of the things that really bothers me about Western support, because it really does feel, especially after the Vogue cover came out with Olena Zelensky, the First Lady, and there's like, I got such a strong sense that if Ukrainians aren't grateful to Europe, we don't deserve their help. Which, again, it boggles the mind because Europe is responsible in very significant ways for this war. Of course, they didn't make the decision to invade, but they, to a very large extent, funded it. They allowed Putin to consolidate his kleptocratic regime. They allowed Putin to hunt dissidents across all of Europe. The Interpol Red Notice system is still being used to literally kidnap people in supposedly safe Western Europe and drag them off to God knows where in Russia, where they then disappear. Europe enabled all of this to happen. And then they turn around and say, oh, well, look, your like First Lady is on the cover of a fashion magazine. How dare you? And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, no one asked your opinion.
But I think so. The Vogue thing has been on the news recently. So let's just mention something about this. Other than like most of the discourse around it has been so mind-bogglingly idiotic, but this is how things are these days. But I think it shows two things. One, Vogue has had actually a what should be an outrageous profile done of a first lady, and it wasn't this time around. It was 11 years ago because they did a profile of Asma al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's wife. And the reason why this was possible, and it came out in March 2011 when the massacre started, like that same month. But the reason it was possible is that there was a US firm, I forgot the name of it, that was being paid $5,000 a month by the Assad regime, which is basically stolen Syrian money, to find some connections and to make this Vogue thing possible. Vogue since deleted the thing on the internet, but you can still find it with archives and obviously reports on it and so on and so forth, because they called Asma al-Assad the rose of the desert, or rose in the desert, or something stupid like that. So this would have been something to be outraged by, but the same kind of people that are supposedly outraged by what's happening by the Vogue cover of like a few days ago don't have anything to say about that, because it's not about the cover. It's not about Vogue. It's not about shallowness in the midst of. It's really not about that. For me, I think the biggest offense that Zelensky caused in Western Europe is that for the most part, he wasn't asking, he was demanding. He wasn't begging. He wasn't, for the most part, he wasn't quite saying. He was saying, like, actually, this is on you as well. With all the critiques towards Zelensky, at this point, when these things happen right now, I don't really care. It's just not as important. But it's really that, and you can feel it. I could feel it in the room, and I wasn't there with them, but I could feel it when he's talking. That some of them were very uncomfortable. Like, who are you to talk to us like this? You from Ukraine, whatever. Like, who are you to talk to us like this? And it's not. And I say it's a secret. It's not a secret. Many of these have come out very publicly. It's now part of like acceptable discourse. In the first few weeks, let's say first month or so after the invasion, even Orban couldn't be too pro Putin. Like he had to kind of tone it down a tiny bit. Like he had to kind of fuck off for a few weeks. But at some point, like these people gain confidence again, and the more this dragged on, the more the war, the closest thing that Europeans started to feel, or the first thing that they were familiar with, or the first thing that they were associating with, wasn't even refugees, because they can extend, say sure, whatever, why not, etc. But it was gas prices, and it was wheat, and it was that. As soon as this became that, and this started dominating conversations and discourses surrounding Ukraine, this is when you start feeling that people started to kind of take a step back, like, oh, maybe we got involved in something we don't want to get involved in. Maybe, that's because for multiple reasons. One, they don't quite understand that they were always involved in one way or another. But it's just that there is no part of the discourse is that makes you believe otherwise, that you can just turn off the news and that's it. But you mentioned Italy before, Romeo, and I have Italian relatives through my wife, and one relative in the early days, I think it was in April or something like that. I remember very clearly. She asked me, like, this Zelensky guy, is he like a fool or a hero in your in your view? And I was like, in my mind, I was like, oh, those are the only two options. But okay, in that case, well, a hero, and obviously. And so, but there is that, and so she didn't disagree with me, but more that the reaction was like, yeah, okay, and that's it. And then we because it was on the news, something was happening on the news. But then after that, well, something else is on the news. Like this is the thing, is that at what point or to what extent are people made to believe that this is something that they're personally involved in? And if they feel personally involved in, then maybe, okay, they can act in a certain way. But if they're sort of told time and time again that, like, don't worry, we'll take care of this, or it will die down, or he can't be that crazy, Putin. He will. We give him something, appeasement basically. And yeah, I don't like to make pre-World War II parallels, obviously, because no situation is ever the same. But discourses tend to rhyme. Discourses tend to echo. These things, even before World War II, the closest thing I can think of is during the Spanish Civil War, where discourses around Franco and then obviously Mussolini and Hitler was like, it's just a Spanish problem. As long as they don't come to France or they don't come to the UK or British Empire at the time or whatever, we won't have to deal with it. And indeed, they had to deal with it not that long after, obviously. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm just realized that I was censoring myself for a couple of last four, I guess, months. So I'm not saying about this publicly. I'm not saying that, guys, this is your fault. But right now I'm thinking maybe I should, because this is something that, of course, Western journalists won't say, because like nobody want to talk about that, because like nobody want to read that. I guess it's very similar. I wrote about that. I guess for me it's very similar with with cooperation that we need for climate change, or for example, cooperation that we need to beat all the gender stereotypes. Like, it's not just I'm giving you my dollar and I feel like I'm a good person. I am a good person, and I know that because I read these books in school. I know something about ethics, and I see myself as a hero because I give you $1. But this is something different. I need to feel a bit of discomfort for myself, for you. And when we talk about discomfort, not just giving something that you actually don't very need, because when we're asking for money, we're asking for something that you might live with this without this $1 per day. But when we're asking to feel some discomfort, oh no, here all the empathy stops, because I don't want to feel cold. Like, I just don't want to feel cold. I don't care about the war. I don't care about the amount of people. I don't want to feel cold because this is discomfort. And I guess this is what I'm feeling right now, that this is the main value in Europe, is the comfort. Like, this feeling of the comfort. Please don't take it away from me, because if we will take away the comfort, what we will have? Like the heritage of good old days of empires. So I guess this is also something that the same what we need with climate change. We need people to feel discomfort. Like, we need to change our like perception of water to save others. And it's not okay. And it's something very important. It's not because I'm a good person. It's because I will be dead. So I guess it's also, we need to shift this idea that we're helping Ukraine because we're good. We know that there is good and bad thing. Like, it's like Star Wars right now perception. There is good force and bad force. And we're no, no, no. It's because if not today, tomorrow, in 10 years, in 20 years, Russia will expand, because this is the idea of empire. The difference is, when it will happen, we won't exist anymore as a Ukraine. So right now we're just trying to say that we, like everyone here, all of your values, all of your comfort will be vanished. Just help us now. And this is very interesting, because again, for me, the same as climate change, because like, it's not about we need to have more food, or like when you need to travel less. No, no, no. It's because your kids won't be able to travel or go anywhere. So yeah, that's why I think it's very uncomfortable situation to discuss. And that's why, and to be honest, a lot of Ukrainians, me as well, I'm scared to talk about that, because I feel like I'm not grateful. And this is some feeling of guilt that you receive as a post colony, that you need to feel grateful to that civilized countries.
Mm.
So I'm also not saying that.
And I think so. This is something that I've noticed when it comes to Syria more than towards Lebanon. But a lot of the times, it's almost like I'm put in a position, and actually with climate change, this happens even more regularly these days. But you're sort of put in a position where you're the one who's ruining the mood of the day, or the mood of the dinner, or the mood of the party, or the mood of the whatever. Most people want to talk about Netflix or series or the weather, which fine, whatever. That's fine to talk about as well. I'm not saying we need to be intense 24/7, but there is this sense of like, if we start talking about this thing, it becomes real. And there is this term that I think I accidentally coined, mutually assured delusion, which is a bit of that. It's like, if five people in the room, if there's a wildfire nearby and there is, I don't know, five people in the room, we can talk about it because it's like nearby. But then when it's done, it's like, it's been defeated or whatever. A week later, 2 weeks later, you don't want usually to be the person who still wants to talk about it. It's like, well, we've dealt with this. Let's move on. And there is a sort of a group pressure on that case. And it's the same thing that happened with the pandemic. It's a very human phenomenon. So the cynicism is in some sense universal. The main difference when it comes to Western European, especially Western Europeans, is that there is a sense, again, that they want to be in denial of the direct role, because there's a difference between like the average Lebanese who's cynical about Ukraine and Russia. For the most part, what happens in Lebanon just doesn't matter. Like factually, it just does not matter. But for every dollar that a Western European has given to a Ukrainian refugee or whatever, how much of that money has gone from their states to fund the Russian state via Nord pipeline one, whatever it's called? Is the scale is just not the same. And again, it's the same thing when the scale isn't the same, and when it's sort of streamlined, there's something that happens psychologically. If there is literally an announcement today in Switzerland that says, or in France, let's say, that says we are going to send $5 billion to Vladimir Putin, and they announce it, many people would be like, what the fuck, don't do this, this is stupid and we need that money, and obviously he's a piece of shit, whatever. But if it's streamlined, like if something that just happens every day, and you don't have to think about it, then it's easier to do. And that's exactly what's been happening. If every single day they had to redecide in Europe, hey, do we want to pay, I don't even know what the daily average is in terms of for gas and oil money to Russia. Many people was like, well, we've been doing this and we've said yes like 90 times since this started. Maybe we should say no now. But it's not a daily decision. It's a streamlined decision. It's like almost left to the magic of the free hand of the market, the magic hand of the market, essentially. But this is where we're at. And because of that, I do think cynicism ends up becoming complicity. And if you start feeling complicit, if you yourself start feeling that, oh, maybe this thing that I'm doing, I might be causing harm, and you don't want to connect A to B. Okay, and so you don't have to connect A to B if everyone around you also doesn't want to connect A to B. Then you're sort of sheltered by the fact that everyone else also doesn't want to do that. And with Syria, it's been that time and time again. Even more extreme, I would say, relatively speaking, all of these things are relative, and I don't like to compare these things, but relatively more extreme than the discourse towards Ukraine. Because at the very least, at the beginning, now it's dying out slowly, hopefully not, but it seems to be the case, there was a sense of like, well, we're sort of involved in this in one way or another, we in Western Europe. But with Syria, there was from the very beginning, like, this is just over there, we have nothing to do with it, we're not connected to this, etc., etc. And it doesn't matter how many times you bring up the fact that actually the regime tortured people on behalf of George W. Bush. Actually, the regime was on good terms with, I think it was Sarkozy or Chirac or whatever at the time. Chirac, I think. It doesn't matter if you bring up these things. Well, that's in the past. Now we don't like him anymore, and whatever. Now it's actually Russia and Iran's fault. Well, I mean, it is in that case, it is. But it doesn't mean that there's no connection. And it doesn't mean that your government, like the Danish have been doing, the Spanish were thinking of doing, etc., and many others. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't be willing to actually be complicit in one way or another by deporting refugees. It doesn't necessarily happen in a sense of the Denmark starts declaring we love Bashar al-Assad, but it does happen in the normalization of discourse around deporting refugees. It happens in different ways, but it happens nonetheless. And now we're at the stage where the Assad regime is de facto recognized. Like, that's it. As far as like the US will not say they recognize it, but de facto that already happened through many deals, accepting a pipeline here and there, all of these things, that has already happened. So what happens officially and what happens kind of de facto, those are nuances that I feel is lost in many of these contexts that we're talking about.
This really reminds me of this. I heard this from some German journalists recently, that they had this idea, right, that they could normalize Russia by trading with it. That like liberal democratic values will pass along to Russia through trade, and as Russia gets richer and people get more comfortable, like democracy will naturally flower. But it really seems to me that literally the opposite happened. Russian values got transferred to Europe. This idea of because Russians love saying like, what does it have to do with me? Like, I'm just some small guy. Like, I don't have any power. I don't have any money. What does anything have to do with me? I'm just trying to live my life and leave me alone. And ignore the fact that, like, I'm sending my kids off to murder you, or I'm paying taxes to a government that's helping a regime commit genocide, or just the fact that we're stealing parts of our neighbor country. Like, just ignore of that. I have nothing to do with anything. Like, I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a fascist, I'm just trying to live my normal life while sharing memes that say Ukrainians are subhuman on social media. But I have nothing to do with anything. And it sounds like this particular value has been passed along to Europe. Because, like, especially in the case of Germany, where they had to go through a society-wide reckoning after the defeat of the Third Reich, and it seemed to be mostly effective. No one is accusing the Germans of all being secretly crypto-fascists or anything. Like, there are far-right movements in Germany, obviously, given their history. But Germany itself is a pretty well-established liberal democracy. But instead of using that kind of introspection of how are we responsible for the events going on today, it seems like they're acting like this typical Russian, where it's like, No, nothing to do with us. Like, yeah, we paid Putin for gas, but where else could we get the gas? Where else could we get the power? Like, I had no choice. I just had to participate in the system. And it really is. So it sounds like Russian soft power has been much more effective in converting European values than the other way around.
Let me add something. Yassin Harsala, a Syrian intellectual, has this. Well, he said this a number of times, but he was describing how the world is becoming Syrianized because the world is in Syria. He said something along those lines. And there is a sense that, this is something that feels like a truism, but it's one of those things that's very difficult to prove, right? Like you can feel it, you can see it, you can sort of make connections, but it's very difficult to like make a very conclusive like A leads to B kind of reasoning. But it does seem that when you appease something that deep down or somehow is wrong, at some point you get impacted morally in one way or another. And this isn't rocket science, or this isn't like a discovery. This has been described many times. This is like, I'm channeling James Baldwin, who talked about white Americans becoming moral monsters by accepting the institution of slavery, for example, for 200, 300 years, right? It's something you don't have to directly participate in it, but if you're benefiting from it in one way or another, it might just affect you in one way or another. The other thing is that I mentioned this before, and so this is already on the record, but I, by complete accident, met the Norwegian ambassador in Lebanon, who was I was just somewhere with a friend, and he was just there, and he decided to talk to us because he felt chatty, and there was no other context. I didn't know who he was. I didn't even know he was the ambassador. I discovered this the next day. But he literally told us, like, quite, like, he doesn't like Putin, again, but the but always follows after that. But it's like, well, we have a maritime border with them and we have trade, and it's very important, and he said it like matter-of-factly, basically, that we don't disrupt this, because if we don't disrupt this, then maybe we have leverage over him, and maybe we can do this and do that and do this. And this, it doesn't matter that factually you can point to the fact that, well, this doesn't seem to have worked so far, and doesn't seem to have worked in the 8 years prior to what just happened. And by your own logic, if you had leverage, well, February shouldn't have happened in the first place if you had leverage, But that doesn't matter, because I think the desire to continue business as usual, and we saw this in the early days of the pandemic, we see this with climate change today, is such a strong feeling, and it involves a wider stratum of society than just those 5 asshole politicians that are corrupt. Like, at some point this ends up being internalized in one way or another. And I do think that you can talk to the average, and here I'm generalizing, but you can talk to the average Western European and all day long about how bad Putin is, and most people will not disagree with you. Like, he doesn't have a huge fan base in that sense, with the exception of 1% of crypto fascists, or like the odd anti-vaxxers who somehow feel like this has something to do with Ukraine or whatever it is. Besides those people, that's fine. But as long as you don't, and I'm repeating myself a bit, but as long as you don't bring the connection to me, like as long as I don't have to personally feel, or my community or my nation or whatever has to personally feel guilty about what's happening now. As long as we don't feel bad about what's happening, we can talk all day long. But if that's the rule of the game, you're absolving yourself from a lot of what's been actually happening. Because as a matter of fact, and this is just a fact that we can say with no hesitation, if that money from the first pipeline was stopped in one way or another, yes, the average European will pay the price, gas hikes, gas price hikes, etc., but Russia would actually be in trouble. And we know this. Like, we just know we can put one and one together. They need a certain amount of money. They can't just make it up from scratch. And this is, as of now, one of the most consistent source of income that they've had. So it's not that complicated to put 2 and 2 together. But yeah, anyway, that's what I wanted to mention on that. We didn't actually talk much about, and if that's okay with you, let's get into it a bit, about sort of like the history and the context of Russian colonialism and Russian imperialism. Because, and I'm mentioning this from 2 different angles at the same time. One as someone who is in Western Europe, and the other as someone from the Arab world, originally from Lebanon. in the Arab world, there is still, I'm not going to say a fan base towards Russia, because I think most people are just apathetic when it comes to or at least they feel like it doesn't concern them. But when there are people who do actively think about it, a lot of people do think that Russia is on their side. And the anecdote that I've mentioned is my little cousin who has nothing to do with the world. He's 11, but he saw somewhere on TikTok, because TikTok is a news source now, um, that Russia loves Palestine and hates Israel. And he asked my sister who then shared with me the screenshot, whether he can put up a poster of the Soviet Union flag in his room. And so obviously this is not going to happen. His mom wouldn't be happy with it or anything like this. But just to tell you that how these things get passed on in very ways that, like, almost if you don't pay attention, you won't realize that you have a Stalinist 11-year-old. But these are part of this is part of how this ends up being circulated. You don't need facts. You need good stories. You need stories that are convincing or persuasive, right? You need to be told that, well, Gaddafi was Pan-African, or you need to be told that Bashar al-Assad resisted Israel. You need to be told these kinds of narratives. And as long as there's enough of a niche online, offline, what have you, of people who sort of have built their entire lives believing these certain stories, it's enough for other people to latch onto that. And facts in and of themselves don't change that. So that being said, and in Western Europe, it's whatever. We'll talk about it, I'm sure. But that being said, how can you explain Russian, or how do you? Because Mariam, you've been doing this online for a few months now, like basically in the role of an educator, if you allow me the term. But like, how do you explain Russian colonialism and Russian imperialism to an audience that is not from the former Soviet Union, or it doesn't have that, or Latvia or whatever, like doesn't have that direct connection to either the USSR or the Russian state before or after?
Okay, so first of all, sorry for everyone who knows the history, because I will say a lot of very, like, I will simplify it a lot. So right now I am preparing. I was actually doing that for the last 2 months. I'm preparing lecture about image of Ukrainian people. No, just image of Ukrainian in Russian culture. I mean, in Russian culture for like last 300 years. So, and I'm reading a lot of bullshit, as you can imagine. So, and as a Ukrainian, I feel a lot of frustration all the time when I'm reading that, but it's also very interesting to see roots of that thing. So, you will see what I'm going to. So, at some point, I was reading something like, oh, yeah, this Russian Scotland. I'm like, what? So yeah, there was naming Ukraine, Russian Scotland. So I guess this is one of the easiest way to explain to a person who never knew anything about that. If you ever watch movie Braveheart, that's the easiest way. Like, this is very simplified. Of course there's a lot of content, but like, if you want to feel empathy, to amount of willingness to feel separate or freely, this is just scream freedom in the end. This is the same. Actually, of course, I will relate to this topic when I will talk about the books that I think it's a kind of good idea to read about Ukraine. So to be more serious, there is centuries of relationship between empire and colony, and it's of course not only Ukraine. It's needed to be explained that it's of course about all other countries that were much smaller than Russia, which is much easier because Russia is the biggest country. And of course, it's not overseas colonization. This is one of the reasons why we don't talk about this kind of colonization, because there is no sea, and if there is no sea, there is no colony, apparently. This is how some researchers of colonialism in Western society thinks. So, what is also important for people who don't know the difference between Western colonialism and a special Russian one. With the Russian one, it's kind of fine if you are have a separate government, which is not fine if you don't think you're part of Russian culture. Russian culture in Russian state is seen as Russian language. So every time you as a country, or you as a person or as a nation, saying that you don't want to be part of Russian language, for them it means that you want to be savages again, and they will civilize you even if it's mean raping and, I don't know, killing you. So this is very important, that if, I don't know, British people didn't call Indian British people. With the Russian idea, it's like the idea of Russia is just expanding. Like, just Russia just became bigger. You are right now Russian. You're Russian. You're Russian. Like in Kazakhstan, for example, right now they're speaking Russian. Of course, it doesn't look like Russian. Of course, Russian people making this distinguish very well. You are not Russian, but if you're part of Russian culture, and of course they are by the mode of movies, TV shows, all of that. So this is very important. What else? Yes, I guess, and for language, I guess language is very important here as well, because if you don't have very distinguished borders of your country, and if these borders are fluid and all the time changing, there is only one thing. There is not a lot of factors for you that define your country or culture. What does actually make you different from Russian person? You look the same. You have potato nose. You know, all of them have potato nose. Let's face it. You like sour cream. You have the same food without any spices. What is actually different in our case in only language. There is no other ways to say that, okay, I'm different, like face it. This is the same for Belarus, because only language made this distinct. So that's why when you hear about, oh, Ukrainians are banning Russian culture, no, there is not banning. There is people. I'm still Russian speaker right now. When I'm speaking with you, I'm translating this from Russian to English. But the idea that we need to save Ukraine by saving language, because there is no other way how we are different. I don't know, did I explain it well or not? But
Yeah, and I mean, another thing, and this is it's something that you specifically can speak towards, that there is a Russian imperialism context when it comes to Afghanistan as well. And so, as it happens, you are from both worlds that can really speak to this aspect of it. So I don't know how much you want to share on this. Feel free, and then maybe we can get Romeo's takes on this as well.
yeah, it was very similar idea with of course not similar, because nobody will say that Afghani people are Russian. This is understandable. But the idea is, again, a lot of Russian Communist Party. And okay, when I'm talking about USSR, I'm talking about Russian communist state, because when you look at the idea of the culture, of course, you were like a lot of people, especially in Western societies, they think that communist country was actually a very good idea, but just failed. No, it wasn't a good idea. It was actually Russian state. The center of culture was only Moscow, which is very typical for all empires. You have the one place where everyone needs to go. If you want to be good at science, you need to go to Moscow. You need to have this metropole, like the idea of it. Everyone was speaking only Russian. You can speak your language, but like again, it's not civilized language. So it was the same basically as an empire, but just with red symbolism. So it was also the idea of civilization, of sharing communist ideas. So it's kind of the same. Like, we're spreading good thing to other countries. It was the same idea with Afghanistan. We will spread. We will share our knowledge for our small brother. And the idea that this small brother didn't want to to have this knowledge, and they had the problem with Afghanistan. I guess it's also kind of like, not, but this is a good way to explain that Russia was aggressive for centuries. Like, it didn't start with Putin. It started. If you like Dostoevsky, just believe me, Dostoevsky is connected to imperialistic culture of Russia. It's the same with Soviet times. So it's kind of ironic that my father was running from Russian state, communist state. He came to another country, and he still had, like, he still kind of had the same problem. And right now his son, who actually was 5 years old when war started in Afghanistan, he was drafted when he was 30, and he was mobilized again when he's 37, and he lost no eye. So, and right now he's became a disabled person. So I guess for me, it's let's talk about this, because I guess this is something that not everyone's understand right now. People think that this aggression is Putin's aggression. And this is just rapidly Putin became crazy, because this is also what I want to kind of emphasize, that for a long time, Russian state tried to build a very good image of Putin. For example, in the same TikTok, there was a lot of cute moments when Putin was hugging puppies. Like, yeah, we know that this is a joke, but we know that this actually have some image in our, like, I never seen Lebanese president with puppy. Like, nobody doing that. Or for example, at some point there was like a lot of how Putin is saying bold jokes, like with Merkel, how he's like bad. Like, there is a lot of things. So I don't want to say that there is no way to try. There is image Putin as a very uh, strong leader that fight for his country. So I guess we need to say that this is not just rapid Putin aggression. This is very with this very logical continuation of Russian culture that was there for centuries. And right now we're here, and if we won't stop, it just will go more further away. What I'm also interested in, what is definition of Europe for Europe? Because Ukraine was Europe and it wasn't Western enough. So when they will try to invade Poland, will it be Western enough or not Western enough? Like, where is the Western thing is stopping? So yeah.
A friend of mine, Adnan, who I know would listen to this for sure. So hi, Adnan. But he's Bosnian, and he is among those who kind of were saying from the beginning, really like end of February, more or less, that like the longer this continues, and the more images of Ukraine get associated with bombed out cities and with ruins, the more psychological distance there will be between the average European and what's happening, Western European, and what's happening in Ukraine. And we saw this with Syria from the beginning, because I think the fact that it was in the Middle East, Arab world, blah, 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 it was easier for lots of people in the West to just associate a house or a city with ruins, was in fact they were rendered into ruins. They were not ruins before 2011. They were actually normal cities like anywhere else. But it becomes easier to make that association. And recently, and this I think is like, it's disgusting, but it's also perfect. It's like a perfect symbolism of everything that's wrong. You have a Chinese production company, film company, that is actually co-produced by none other than Jackie Chan, who many people don't know is a piece of shit. But he is funding this movie that is actually being filmed in Syria in a destroyed, I think it's Aleppo, I don't remember where, or Homs or something, like in Syria, to shoot a movie that describes a heroic whatever of Chinese diplomats being rescued from Yemen. So as far as the average Chinese viewer is concerned, this is the logic that went into the production company. They won't know the difference between a bombed out Syrian city and a bombed out Yemeni city. So the irony is that Yemen is destroyed largely because of the Saudis. I mean, the Houthis aren't innocent, but largely because of the Saudis. They are the ones bombing from the sky. And it looks similar to the average person who's going to watch that movie to the bombing that's been happening by the Russians and by the Assad regime over Syria. That same government that is obviously those governments allied with the Chinese government. So it's come full circle essentially, and that same psychological distance that the average Chinese person might have with Syria is the same distance, as far away as Yemen, for example. And I think the risk now is that, and speaking of Bosnia, things are happening in Bosnia as well. But I'm going to pin this because I actually want to say something on this. But so the worse things get, essentially, and the longer it drags on, the more there will be this psychological distance. But speaking of Bosnia, you mentioned before, Romeo, like, well, Germany supposedly has, at least or definitely has done more soul searching than the average Brit or the average American or the average French. But honestly, I think the bar is very low. But and that is true. But what it means is that it gets translated into different ways. Like this authoritarian tendency, I think, is still there. It's not the same. I never want to make comparisons, but aspects of it are still there. And what's happening now in Bosnia is that you have this German, the high representative of Bosnia, because of the Dayton Agreement, it's someone from the EU. So this guy, this time it's a German guy, who's going to impose an election law that discriminates against non-constitutive, quote unquote, minorities in Bosnia, namely Roma and Jews, among other minorities in Bosnia. Now, if I came to tell you, hey, there's this German guy who is going to impose an election law that is going to discriminate against Roma and Jews, it doesn't sound very good. There are echoes there. Again, not the same, but the echoes are there. And so for me, it's a bit of that. It's the fact that it tends to happen. Like what gets media attention and what doesn't. In Bosnia, it's not getting media attention, so these things we can happen. In Ukraine, we know from the beginning, and honestly, I think Zelensky, as a media person, understood this from the beginning. And honestly, kudos to him on this. I'm not gonna lie, I was impressed that he managed to understand how the average Westerner thinks, because yes, he had to go to the fucking Academy Awards or whatever the fuck it was. He had to do these things, the Vogue thing. These things actually matter. I wish they didn't, but they do. And he understood that you need to maintain a spotlight, because other than that, it's very, very quick for the average European or average Western European specifically, and their governments especially, to try and turn a blind eye, to try and just sweep it under the rug, to try and just appease and normalize and just let's move on, let's wish it away essentially.
For a second, I wanted to circle back to Russian imperialism. Something you said, Mariam, really struck with me. Something that I think Westerners don't understand at all, especially the types that become Stalinists through TikTok. This idea that the Soviet Union was a Russian empire. When I was very little, and I learned Russian like naturally. I never took formal education in Russian, so I grew up in the U.S., so I never read like Russian literature. No one ever forced me to remember like poems by Pushkin or whatever the hell, which thank God for that. But when I was a kid, and my great aunt was a huge lover of Russian literature. Our family is this kind of archetypical Soviet intelligentsia family. Um, and I remember this phrase that she used to tell me when I was struggling with Russian, it went something like, even if I was a farmhand in a village in Africa, I would still try and learn Russian because it is the language of Lenin. And Miriam you might have heard this that before, uh, and it really struck me. Like at the time, obviously, I didn't think of anything of it. It wasn't until really after I moved to Ukraine, 2014, that I understood the difference between being a Soviet person and being a Ukrainian. Because I grew up in basically a Soviet culture. My parents immigrated right in 91, when we were all Soviet, and obviously as I said, I come from a family of Soviet intelligentsia. My grandparents are both professors, so it was very much ingrained that like this is just normal. This is just like, yes, of course you should know Russian. It's the most beautiful, most civilized language ever. Why wouldn't you know Russian? Like, why would you speak Ukrainian? Like, yeah, people from villages speak Ukrainian, but you're from this cultured family. Why would you speak Ukrainian? Um, and this idea that you like this tie between Russia and culture and civilization, which is such a strong societal meme, that it even in parts of Ukraine it still persists, despite all the evidence to the contrary, is not at all something that Westerners tend to associate with Soviet Union. They're like, oh, the empires are done. The Bolsheviks came in. The friendship between peoples. But in reality, all the cultural memes that we were taught weren't even communist memes. They were just Russian imperial memes. Russia's the best. Moscow's the greatest city in the world. It has the best metro. It has the best infrastructure. It has the best universities. One of my goals as a child, for my grandmother, was to have me enroll in KMOA, the Moscow like governance university. Basically, where all the top Russian like bureaucrats and diplomats, they come from this one university in Moscow. And my grandmother's goal was for me to also go there because I wanted to be a lawyer when I was a kid. She's like, well, obviously you have to go here. And it's so difficult to talk and explain this particular understanding to Westerners, that we're not talking about some amorphous like communist country. it was just Russian. Yeah, it had some hammers and sickles, and people like to use the word worker a lot. But other than that, it was basically just purely Russian. Speaking any other language was considered like village speak, not just Ukrainian, but if you spoke Georgian or Armenian or Uzbek, and God forbid you had an accent, because that just meant you're a barbarian, you're uncultured, you're barely human. So it's not even just speaking Russian. You had to speak perfect Russian. I when I was in college in the U.S., one of my classmates was Uzbek, and obviously her Russian was perfect. And I was always super curious, like, shouldn't she have an accent? Like most people have accents, like Indians have accents when they speak English, right? They don't sound like they just stepped off the set of a Shakespeare play. Americans obviously have accents when they speak English. Africans have accents when they speak French. Why is it that all of like the ex-Soviet republics, you had to speak perfect Russian, and anything less than that was considered to be a degradation? And it drives me crazy because that, I think, is one of the key ways to truly like understand that Russia has been an empire this whole time. And this whole time, it's been engaged in the business of erasing every cultural identity that isn't Russian, wherever its guns could reach. And to understand that, you really need to grasp this point that that's all like that's so much of what they were concerned with, was selling this idea that Russia is a cultured country, of course, and then their soldiers go and castrate POWs on Telegram.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it to the to the listener to decide how cultured Russia really is.
I can only add quickly two things. That one thing, it makes me laugh sometimes, and there's an Arabic expression called al-mudhak mubke. So like what is funny is actually sad. So it's like both at the same time. But those memes and those posters, the Soviet posters that many people like tankies and whatnot and others share on the internet. It's like if you just have the exact same poster and just remove the Cyrillic alphabet and just make it in English or in French, what does that look like? Like, just you always have a white person who's in the center. You always have a white person who's at the head of. Okay, maybe we'll put a black person there somewhere. It's okay, but like not at the front, not in the center. Put it on the sides. What does that look like? What does it sound like if you hear, well, everyone had to learn the language, everyone had to learn English or French? What does that remind you of? Everyone had to speak with a perfect accent. You mentioned like the average Indian or American don't speak like the English. Yeah, but the English tried. They tried to make everyone speak the Queen's English, as it's called. They just failed. They just were not good at it. And so people learned the language but kept their accents essentially. But the impulse isn't that different. But again, it's just that it's in Cyrillic. It has like Soviet music is like nicer than British Imperial music, and that's enough. Some echo, some choirs here and there, and some nice imagery, and a fist somewhere. I don't know, whatever it is, and that's enough. It's like it's memes, as you mentioned before. These are memes. Even before the internet, they were memes, and now they just get spread around differently. Now you can remix them on TikTok, but other than that, it's the impulse is sort of the same, or the phenomenon is sort of the same.
Yeah, and I just want to also that because I'm preparing this lecture. There's a very interesting phenomenon of there was actually hierarchies of different nations in Soviet times. So, frankly speaking, Ukraine was next after Russian one. So we were kind of on the top. Second were after us was like Belarusian people, and after that nobody cares. And of course, gypsies people are on the very bottom, like nobody Chukchas and then gypsies. So what is important, and they still have it right now. This is this idea that was kind of, I guess, connecting culture of modern Russia to like 20 years to 200 years ago, imperialistic Russia. So the idea of that, if you want to make a joke, you just need to say, so Russian, Ukrainian, of course, are different languages, but there were some specific sounds that world what in Russian sounds like что, and in Ukrainian is sho, що. So if you will just remove this sh sound, just put this sh sound, this will make this joke funny because Ukrainian language is a comical language. There is a lot of stuff like that. So right now, for example, Russian propaganda, oh my god, yeah, I want to say bad word, but anyways, Russian journalists, they were saying something like, if they want to humiliate, they are saying something like Ukrainian independency. What they're saying is незалежность. So they're taking Ukrainian word and making it sound funny. I read about it that they were doing that 200 years ago with the same connotation, that you will just take Ukrainian word, and in Ukrainian, because it's not real language, the meaning of the word will be opposite because it's not real one. So when you say independency of Ukraine yeah, in this kind of Ukrainian language, it means that it's very dependent. And I was so shocked that again it was starting in the anecdotes and jokes in Russian, like in Soviet time. It was very typical and very normal. So, and it's very interesting to hear that there is no racism in Soviet times. Or, for example, I'm seeing right now that because of Soviet time, all the country of post-Soviet time are not ready to feminism, because people are thinking that feminism is something that they have in Soviet time. When you work in the fabric, or like, I don't know, doing something 8 hours after you come home and you cook for whole family. This is feminism, the an idea of post-Soviet countries. And when you say no, 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 it means that you work and you come at home and you work together, or like you can delegate. They're not used to that. So the idea is like, no, 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 I don't need feminism. I just want to relax and don't do work. So I every time I'm trying to emphasize to some Western, I don't know, lefties, that there was no feminism. Actually, they're saying about that, but it wasn't true. So I guess it's also our task to say this thing, because we know, Romeo, we're so used to it. It's so obvious for us that we don't even, like, every time we hear that somebody is having sympathy to communist Russia, we're like, what? Like, it's just joke. Like, it couldn't be true. Like, how you can. So I guess this is some gap between the knowledge, and we need to explain it better, maybe.
I will only add to that, if that's okay, that the closest equivalent to me is when I see just random Westerners uh, say good thing about the Iranian government. And by any objective definition, or by any like objective, I don't know, descriptions of what counts as right wing, left wing, far right, far left, the Iranian government is pretty far right, like by almost any standard. The morality police that they have is straight out of an Orwellian book. Like, they quite literally have a morality police. Like, it's not, I mean, they don't need, it's just there. But the other thing that's very similar is that essentially what I'm hearing is that, well, we didn't need feminism because we had communism. Like, we didn't need feminism because we had this equality, blah, 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 blah. And in Lebanon, not just Lebanon, but especially Lebanon and kind of Iran in some cases, like, we don't need feminism. We have Islamism. You know, we don't need feminism. We have this other structure that just, it provides equality, but just don't talk about it too much. Like, just it functions. You know, it does its job. It's okay. We're good enough. We don't need to be like whatever. It's usually also the discourse is like this feminism is just, an a import from the West, essentially. And ignoring Lebanese feminists or Iranian feminists, obviously completely erasing them, or just saying like, they're just naive or whatever. But so it's interesting to me that the specific vocabulary changes, and it's a different language, and it's a different context and different history and whatnot, but there are these underlying tendencies that seems to travel quite a bit. Like, it's something that I see in different contexts. Again, it's not always the same, but it's certain tendencies definitely seem to be, travel across context and across time, for sure.
Yeah, especially it in a lot of ways it seems that despite the different kind of cultural connotations and the different language, people are still saying the same thing. And this especially applies to feminism or any kind of LGBTQ rights. That is, like, you will hear so often that this is a Western import. Um, and you're like, how is this kind of universal value that people should like maybe work together? Is how is that a Western value? Isn't that just base logic? Like, and you hear it so often. I mean, in feminism, in feminism at least in Ukraine, like there is the stereotype of the strong like woman, the strong matriarch. So for some aspects of feminism, and I want to be very clear that this is just some aspects of feminism, um, it's like it's easier to accept. But when you get to stuff like LGBTQ rights, like all of that goes out the window, and this is purely some Western decadent Western import, and you're like, but it's the 21st century and the Soviet Union's been gone for 30 years. What are you talking about? You want to be in the West. Like you want West you everyone talks about how Western products are better than like post-Soviet ones. Everyone wants to get salary in dollars. Everyone wants to work for some cool Western company. Everyone uses Western websites. What do you mean it's a Western import? Everything you have is a Western import. And more importantly, everything you want is also Western import.
What
But this specific thing is bad because it's Western. You're skipping a step there in your logic.
the joke of that is common among people who don't like Hezbollah in Lebanon is that they will criticize America Shaitan, America the devil, all day long, but would be very happy to buy American products in US dollars. And there is a disconnect there in one way or another, but it doesn't whatever, it doesn't matter. Listen, it's an hour and a half, and obviously with these kinds of episodes I can go on for like 5 hours, but the podcast doesn't allow me more than 2 hours. Otherwise I could literally not even upload it on the website. But what I want to do before we kind of slowly wrap up and then we get into the book section later is just talk, and we'll have to summarize just because it's not possible to go too much into it. But as it happens, like Romeo, you're yourself part South Asian. I don't know from where exactly, but you had mentioned it once. And of course, Mariam, you mentioned the Afghan origins. What can you tell us, if anything at all? Because let me put it this way: when there is a situation like a war right now, there is obviously a tendency in a society to kind of come together, and that's like in the UK, it's that infamous the Blitz spirit, right? Like we come together, we'll all tighten our belts, we'll blah blah blah, all of that stuff. And of course that's good and that's necessary and that's important and all of that stuff. And what tends to happen in a situation, which is very natural, is that internal differences in a society, internal tensions, internal problems, whatnot, tend to kind of be put aside, be put away, at least temporarily. And again, this is normal. It happens in literally every context. I know, for example, from the Lebanese example, that in the 80s, even though Hezbollah was assassinating communists, there were times where Hezbollah and the communists were allies because they were fighting Israel. There was, they you find ways to accept contradictions and tensions and whatever. That's just the reality of it. But given that, as it happens, both of you come from mixed backgrounds in Ukraine, what are certain insights that you feel that you've had in the past few months that maybe other Ukrainians don't have, or definitely that, let's say, Westerners don't have, if I can put it that way?
Maybe you can start if you want.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. As you can see, it's not a very easy topic to it just right now I feel like it's a very complicated topic to talk about, because I felt very lonely every time in Ukraine when I just try to discuss it. And because Ukrainians, and sorry, Ukrainians, don't please kill me for that, they are mostly denying that they have racism. Racism is something that Russians have, not us. There is no racism because you don't see it, because there is a reason why you don't see racism. Um, and every time you try to explain some problem with racism, people are like, nah, don't, like, you are overreacting, or like, and because you didn't have other people who look the same as you, so you didn't have any like support or like another ethnical group, you feel like you're actually only one drama queen here. For example, in my family, we were taught that we need to wash ourselves so carefully because people assume that we are stink, like, all the time. And I remember my brother was saying that to me, that I need to wash my face so much because, again, when you have small pigmentation, like, of course you have different, like, some part of your face is more white, some part is not. And my brother was saying, like, you need to wash it so hard so it will be the same color, so people won't assume that you are dirty. My father all the time felt super awkward in all restaurants because all of these forks, like he wasn't sure, like he was shaving, I don't know, maybe twice per day, so nobody will assume that he's barbarian or something like that. And of course, right now, after I start to realize, okay, what was happening, I try to share that to my friends, but this is not a very easy topic to share. I guess for Western countries, it's like more typical discussion, but for Ukraine is not because like we don't have so many immigrants, we don't have so many refugees. So sometimes, I remember when I was sharing these stories to my Ukrainian friends, they were like, "But you don't even look not Ukrainian. You're almost white," and I'm like, "This is even like their thing is fine," and you're
You
like,
have no idea how many times one of my friends has said, "But Uroma, you're like almost you're basically white.
"Yes."
Like let's compare our arms. I just got done tanning. Look, we're the same." I'm like, "What?"
Yes. And you're like, no, it doesn't work that way. I'm not became Ukrainian only because you made me Ukrainian. Like, and so, this is, I guess, oh my God. Yeah, there is like a lot of very bad stories, of course. I'm talking about everyday racism. I'm not talking about the people who want to beat you. Like, just put these people aside. So this thing is like a big problem. So we're like, oh, Mara, but like, so in Ukrainian, we have this thing that's Ukrainian standard of beauty is a black eyes and black brows. And everyone was like, oh, you're such a typical Ukrainian, like it's a joke. Like you're such a typical Ukrainian girl with brown eyes and brown eyebrows. And I'm like, this is just, yeah. So this is a bit. I'm just hoping that one day, no, I'm not hoping. I know it will happen because we cannot stop globalization. And the Romeo that there will be more people like us, and people just need to deal with this. So, but yeah, right now you feel like you're a minority of the minorities because you don't have other people like you. And I also saying that this is a good way of reaction and bad. So my reaction is bad because I'm trying to emphasize this. I'm saying, guys, this is not good. Don't react, like don't do this. I don't know. When I was saying that at school we had like this preparation for the army for guys, and we had Kalashnikovs. So it was basically the best jokes to give me Kalashnikov and make a picture and send it to social media. And I was saying that this was like, it's not a good thing to do. And people are saying, yeah, Mariam, but you will overreact because I have another friend. He's half Syrian and he's a big black. And when I see him, I just give him some bananas and we're just laughing. I'm like, this is not okay. So people assume that this is my problem. And I hope that at some point we will just change that. And we discuss this with brothers that we will put this topic after war, not now.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed, especially um when I was a kid and I would go to Ukraine, is people assume you're a foreigner up until like people would assume I was a foreigner up until I opened my mouth. And my Russian is more or less unaccented. Like obviously it's not perfect Russian. I mean, I spent most of my life in the US, but more or less my Russian sounds native. So actually when I just moved here in 14, I would go to like a bar or the club or something, and girls would be interested in me up until the moment I would speak in Russian, because that's when I transfer from being some exotic American guy to just a buddy, just a guy, just a dude. Um, which on the one hand is nice, on the other hand, people still make a lot of assumptions. Like, um, I can't tell you how many times like I've gone through the conversation of, oh, where are you from? Well, I was born in Vinnytsia. No, where are you really from? I'm like, I was born in Vinnytsia, I just told you. And they're like, no, where are your parents from? Well, my mom's from Vinnytsia. And they're like, and then they're confused. Like the wheels in their head don't quite click. And if I'm feeling like really nice, I'll go, okay, my dad's from Bangladesh. But I was born in Venus. As you can see, I can speak Russian. It's my native language. And people don't really understand why that's an offensive question. They don't see how like being, but where are you from really is hurtful. Like there's a lot of stuff that Ukrainians don't really understand, and this idea of, oh, like you're just overreacting is a huge part of it. Because Ukrainians don't want to like confront that part of Ukrainian culture. Even when like my wife is from a small village outside of Kiev. She is as Ukrainian country girl like as they come. Her village has a population of like 1,000 people, and her parents work the farm. That's what they've done for their entire lives. And that's what she did for most of her life as well. And when like I went there for the first time, I was like incredibly, I don't want to say cautious. I was apprehensive that I'm gonna like really stand out. Luckily, her parents turned out to be like completely fine, and accepted me, which I'm greatly indebted to. Um, but there's always this apprehension, and one of the things I will say, one of the negative kind of portions of this war, was I went through a checkpoint near my apartment the other day, and I'm in a cab. The like guard motions the cab to pull over. He starts checking the documents. I pull up my passport on like the mobile app or whatever, and he's looking at it. He's like, so he's like, where do you live? For some reason, they always ask that. I'm like, well, I live in like Vishneva. It's the like suburb that we this is the checkpoint that separates Vishneva and Kiev. And he's like, when did you get your Ukrainian passport? I'm like, excuse me? And then he looked at a bit more, and he's like, oh, this is from birth. I'm like, yes, what does it matter? Like, I'm obviously not Russian. I don't know what to tell you. Um so there is like a bit of parochialism, I guess you could call it, that comes out. But at the same time, I do want to stress this because I mentioned this a lot. Is like I grew up in New York, and legitimately, I have experienced less institutional racism here, like harassment from the cops or people like a lot closing their windows when I walk past. That happened a lot. Like that has happened noticeably way less than that ever happened in the U.S. Even in New York, which you'd think is like the bastion of liberalism or whatever. Um, so I think mostly the problem with racism more will eventually fade away because Ukraine isn't wedded to racism as a core concept of their of our culture. It's not really a thing. Like Russians love pointing out how anti-Semitic Ukrainians are, which I always found hilarious because we're talking about Russians here. Um, Russians are just they are wedded to racism as a cultural value. It is one of the foundational aspects of being Russian is that you're an Orthodox Slav. And while you do have aspects of that in Ukraine, it's nowhere near as pronounced. And especially for like Jews, they're they are also more or less not really touched or considered to be any like some kind of other. Generally speaking, obviously, there's still. I don't want to say that this country has no anti-Semitism because that's obviously not true.
No, I mean,
Generally speaking, people don't care.
the conversation is important because there's obviously a nuanced difference between saying there is racism and there is anti-Semitism and there is whatever homophobia, transphobia, etc. in our country, and saying this is inherently who we are and we are, inherently wrong or inherently not inherently, but like something fundamental about who we are is wrong because obviously that you get into a very dark slippery slope, which is basically what Putin has been saying in it already. But like what is true, and this is like a final small comment, it's not what is true that in the West, broadly speaking, there is some kind of conversation around race that is more pronounced at the very least than, let's say, in the Arab world, which is what I can speak to confidently. It really depends where, and it depends to what extent are you allowed to push it. Essentially, like for my example, or the ones I'm most familiar with, are like the UK, France, and Italy, Switzerland to a lesser extent, but especially those three. And in France, you would have some conversation around it, but for example, the limitation has to do with religion rather than race. But it doesn't mean that there is no racialization. It doesn't mean that there is no otherization on the basis of race. It just means that the vocabulary that is used is different. In Italy, it's actually very common to use terms like he looks Italian or he doesn't look Italian. And what's kind of very weird is that I've been in a situation in Italy many times, because I've been there many times with family connections and stuff, where the person assumes I'm Italian because many people from the Mediterranean kind of look the same. Assume I'm Italian until I open my mouth and I have an accent and I'm clearly not Italian, or assume immediately that I can't possibly be Italian, even before opening my mouth. And I've never quite understood what is it? Like, is it the length of my beard? Maybe if I've shaved, if I've not, maybe if I've shaved more, I look from the south. I'm not in, because I've been in a situation where it's like they made a comment about how light my skin, how like dark my skin was. And I'm like, light, dark, whatever the description of my skin is, I'm not sure.
I'm pretty
But
sure I've seen Sicilians with darker skin than you.
that's exactly what I mean, is that I've been in a situation where I was with someone who is like an Italian or Sicilian or whatever, who has darker skin than I do, but who's commenting on the darkness of my skin. And I was like, what do I do in this situation? Have you looked at yourself? You know? But this is not uncommon. It's a very odd, very parochial, maybe that's the term. It can translate itself into overt racism when it's like someone who is like of African origin, let's say, or who is Afro-Italian or whatnot, then they definitely bear the brunt of these kinds of things. Whereas for me, it's more like, I don't know, maybe on a good day I look Italian, on a bad day I don't. It's very like flip of the coin kind of situation. But it's a very interesting thing. I actually find it very like fascinating that I've been in a situation where it's like, yeah, obviously you're Italian, and other situation where like, obviously you're not. What are you talking about? It's like, what has changed since yesterday? I'm still the same. Nothing else has changed. Anyway, whatever. Wanted to
Maybe
kind
it's
of,
before and after coffee.
maybe it's before and after coffee, yeah. But whatever. I'm not gonna start about Italian breakfast culture now. But
Uh,
yeah,
I just, last thing that I want to
yeah,
add
yeah.
also, that for 20 years I was lying that I'm Indian origin, not of Ghanaian origin. So it was also interesting thing about me. So first of all, it's very important so nobody will think you're a gypsy. Oh my god, this is like, Romeo, you for sure you know what I feel like. You just like, oh my god, please don't assume that I'm gypsy. And of course, when you became older, you understand how this is a bullshit concept. But at some point, I realized I'm ashamed to say that I'm Afghani because again, people a lot of were at war, and maybe I'm talking to guy and his father was dead there, and I feel guilty. So I was for a long time I was saying that I'm Indian, half Indian, and everyone's like, oh nice, and they start to sing some songs because this is basically what people know about India from Ukraine. We didn't have Hollywood, so we had Bollywood, and then people have a lot of sympathize to Indian men. Maybe that's why my mom married my husband, my father. I don't know, but anyways,
That's why
for
my
me.
mom married my father.
So this is like another thing for me that's it was actually also kind of hard because again, Indian is kind of nice exotic. Afghanistan is not nice exotic. Like it's barbaric. It's like one of my teacher, a professor. It was like it was deontology for lawyers. I was studying law at first degree, and I was like talking about LGBT rights, and my people in my group they were disagree with me. And at some point, professor told me, "Oh, Mariam, it's so interesting that with your heritage and with your roots, you're talking so much." And I was like, "Oh, nice compliment." And wait a minute. So like, because if I will say that I'm Indian, people won't assume that. But since I'm Afghani, it means that I'm not allowed to speak or something like that. So it's also interesting that there is like there is like levels of ethnicity that's cool or not. So Italian is cool, but maybe when you Middle Eastern, it's not so cool anymore.
In France, you have good exotic and bad exotic. You're good exotic if from Lebanon, like we're kind of fetishized. Like among the other Arab groups, we're like, oh, it's like it's fine. We like you. You have good food or whatever it is. And with Japanese, for example, like Japanese people are fetishized in Europe, for the or South Koreans for that matter, much more so than the average Chinese, for example. So yeah, you have K-pop or you have anime or like we like your food, whatever. It's like there's something that happens that shifts. There's a hierarchy of threats essentially. Like how likely are you to be disregarded, or how likely are you to be fetishized? And like because fetishization is a problem as well, but it's that it doesn't have the immediate threats, let's say, or the immediate discrimination or what have you. Okay, on that relatively light topic, I'm going to ask you now, Mariam, if that's okay, to recommend the books that you wanted to recommend, so we can sort of wrap it up on that note. We'll go slightly over 2 hours, but it's okay. I'll edit some of it out. It's fine. So go
Okay.
for it.
So I guess, of course, if you want to know more than movie Braveheart about Ukrainian relationship with Russia, I guess it's important to read Eva Thompson book about imperial knowledge, which is basically talk about Russian imperialism in Russian literature, so people will understand that there's actually roots in that. Also, if you want to to read something more patriotic and more to find more information about how long is the history of Ukrainian fight for freedom. I guess I need to say that you should try to read Shevchenko, Taras Shevchenko. He wrote Kobzar. This is kind of very known book, but also if it's too long for you, you can try to read his poem Katerina, which is starts with something like people, if you want to have love, don't have love with Russian people. It is basically talk about Russian soldiers, of course, not Russian people. And my last book will be just one of my favorite books. It's Max Stirner. Oh no, it's Max Frisch, but book called Stiller. Yeah, that's it. And if I need, I can give you a link for that books for these books.
That's amazing. Okay, any sort of like final thoughts? Where can people find you online? That sort of thing. Romeo, you as well. Go for it.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm tweeting a lot, and I'm trying to tweet without frustration, but it's hard. And I have Instagram, but Instagram banned me for last 2 months. So I'm trying to have my new account on Instagram. I'm talking a little bit more in Ukrainian also, but there is English speaking posts. So.
As for me, I am also on Twitter. You can find me at Romeo Kokriatski. If you don't know how to spell that, good luck.
It's gonna be in the title of the episode or whatever.
There you go. There you go.
If they don't find it, that's just laziness.
You can also listen to my podcast, which is a lot easier to spell. It's called Ukraine Without Hype, where me and my co-host we talk about Ukraine news because we're journalists and we live in Ukraine.
And I've been a guest on that podcast.
Yes, you have, Joey. Yes, you have. Highly recommend that episode. Joey's a fantastic guest, a fantastic speaker.
Thank you. So, okay, you two. All that's left is for me to thank you for this just under 2 hours long conversation, which is fantastic. Thank you. I don't have to edit as much now, but thank you two for doing this, and it will be out a week from when we're recording it, so the first Friday of August. So, yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.